Hello everybody, it's Jay Rowe. We're going to be taking a look at the Ruy Lopez Berlin defense in this video. And this is the second installment into my Ruy Lopez opening videos. And the Ruy Lopez opening, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, scores usually a 41% win for white, 26% win for black, and a 32% draw. So you can tell by those numbers that, you know, when you're playing against someone who knows what they're doing with the opening, it is a favorable opening for white. But that being said, it's also a very complicated and complex opening in terms of the amount of variations and lines that exist for it. So it's really quite a mouthful to study. Now, in this video, like I said before, we're going to look at the Berlin defense, which takes place after black plays knight to f6. Now, for those of you not familiar with the Ruy Lopez opening, I'm just going to take us back to the very start of the game here and show you the opening moves for the Ruy Lopez, otherwise known as the Spanish opening. Basically, it starts out with white pushing the pawn to e4, so it's king-pawn opening. Black plays pawn to e5, white plays knight to f3, and then black will play knight to c6. And from here, the white player plays bishop to b5, and this is the Ruy Lopez Spanish opening. Now, from this position here, there's a number of continuations that could take place. My first video looked at the classical defense, and in this video here, we're going to look at the Berlin defense, which is when black plays knight to f6. And in fact, this is one of the most popular responses by black against the Ruy Lopez. So if you play Ruy Lopez online, you've probably seen this move, knight to f6, plenty of times. I know I have personally. Now, interestingly enough, though, before I started studying the Ruy Lopez in detail, I used to, from this position, I would always play knight to c3. But that's goes into the four-knight Spanish variation. So before I studied it, that's what I played, and we're going to take a little look at that line later on. But for now, we're just going to stick with the book moves for the Berlin defense. Now, one of the things you'll probably notice right off the bat, if we're looking at white's position, is that after black brings the knight to f6, it's attacking the undefended pawn on e4. And as I mentioned before, I used to play knight to c3 in response to that. But as it turns out, when I studied the opening for this video, white doesn't really have to worry about losing that pawn right off the bat, because white has a couple options to either A, gain the material back, or B, get a very strong positional edge that will lead to the material getting equal later on. So it turns out that white's best move in this position is simply to castle. Now, black has a couple options here. Black can play, say for example, a6 at this point. Black can also get into the Berlin classical variation by bringing the bishop to c5, and then, of course, as we were kind of talking about a little bit earlier, black could come down and take the pawn on e4. We're going to look at all three. Now, we're going to get into the captured variations first. So let's say black comes down to take that pawn. As a white player, the best move in this position is to play pawn up to d4. And we're going to look at a couple of the bookline options for black in this position. The first one we're going to look at is knight to d6. Now, knight to d6 is attacking the undefended bishop on b5. But as it turns out, this is really good for white, because white can simply capture the knight now on c6, and black will most likely capture with the d-pawn. That opens up access to the bishop and the queen, so it's kind of a dual-purpose move for black. But from here now, white can simply capture with the pawn, and the only thing that's stopping white from crashing down into the position with a check, trading the queens off and preventing black from castling, is the knight here on d6. But that knight is being attacked by a pawn, so black's only real option here, other than going down a piece, is to move the knight off to, say, f5, at which point white can now come crashing down and prevent black from castling for the rest of the game. And from this position, really, white has a slight positional advantage in terms of the black king being exposed and uncastled. Black has a couple of good things going for it in that it's going to have the bishop pair, but really with careful play from white, there's really no reason that white shouldn't be able to find the win from this position. So that's one of the book lines after the black knight captures and white plays pawn to d4. Let's go back and we'll take a look at another option that black has, which is pawn to a6. Now, pawn to a6 is also attacking the undefended bishop here on b5. But from this position, white can simply capture the knight, and once black recaptures, white can play rook to e1. And this knight is currently undefended, so either black's going to have to move the knight or defend it. If black moves the knight, say for example back to f6, white can gain that material back with check. And if black decides to, say, for example, bring the bishop out or the pawn to defend the knight, white can simply capture the pawn here on e5, and now all of a sudden black's going to be presented with open access to the queens, with the fundamental difference being that white's already castled and black hasn't. So it's going to be a positional advantage for white coming out of here as well, and that's what could happen from pawn to a6. Now let's go back to the castle move by white, and we're going to take a look now at the Berlin classical variation, which happens when instead of coming down to capture the pawn on e4, black develops bishop to c5. And this leads to a very aggressive line for both players, actually, and it's quite interesting how the main lines go on these. But some possibilities include knight coming to capture the pawn on e5, black captures pawn on e4, and after queen develops to e2, black can play knight captures because the bishop here isn't quite pinning that knight down yet because the pawn is still present on d7. From here, white can capture that knight back, and black can develop queen to e7. And from here, white can play the knight up to c3, eyeing up the d5 square. Black can play knight back to g6, offering up the queen trade. White can actually accept in this position because after black recaptures with the bishop, white can come in with a nice forking possibility here on c7. Now black will play bishop back to d6, and from here white can land the check. Black moves the king off to d8, and then from this position, white has now prevented black from castling again in these lines. So there's definitely some possibilities for white after black develops bishop to c5 to go ahead and take that pawn, because black really can't do much about it. Like, it couldn't really come in and capture due to the fork that would come after pawn to d4. So there's definitely some possibilities that white has to gain a slight positional advantage depending on how play follows. Now we're going to go back to bishop to c5 for a moment because white also has another move that's a little more safe positionally. So if you want to maintain an equal footing, you could play something like pawn to c3. From the lines that I looked at, pawn to c3 usually elicits a castle from black, and from here you can develop pawn now to d4, and when black plays bishop back to b6, this is a complete equal position. So those are the two kind of main possibilities there for the Berlin classical variation. Now I want to take a moment to go back to knight to f6 before I end the video off, and I want to talk a little bit about the possibility of playing knight to c3, which is kind of a different opening strategy altogether in that it's the 4-knight Spanish variation. And as I mentioned earlier on in the video, I used to play this all the time when I saw knight come out to f6. But after I looked at the Berlin defense lines, I think I'm totally going to be changing my strategies when I see the Berlin defense come out. But after knight to c3, there is an opportunity to get equality in the position. After knight comes down to d4, white can play bishop to a4, which is an equal position, but I think just looking at it, after going through the Berlin defense possibilities on some of the main lines for that one, I think white's just going to have a less difficult time capitalizing on the position. I think like here we have a knight really well placed here on d4. We have the pawns here that are eventually going to come out, in particularly to c6 supporting a center push. And I think that if we go back to knight to f6, I think in this position the castle is the best move. And then as we covered in the video, you know, if black comes down to take this pawn, there's some really good opportunities to get either the material back right away or just a very strong position outright. Or if black comes down with the Berlin classical variation, we have opportunities here, especially with the knight capturing on e5 to lead to a good fun game, or alternatively just a safe position to play pawn to c3 followed by d4. So I definitely enjoyed going through the lines and the opportunities for the Berlin defense, especially as a Ruy Lopez player. And I tried to boil it down to the initial moves, in particularly the castle after knight develops to f6, and what a good move seemed to be after black took the pawn on e4, and just tried to boil down the initial moves, and from those moves you get into a lot of variations, but the general theme seems to stay consistent in terms of who's got the advantage, or at least the possibility for an advantage with solid play. So I'm definitely looking forward to your feedback on that, and especially if you're Ruy Lopez players, or even black playing against the Ruy Lopez using the Berlin defense. So take care, hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you next time.